Israel has an extensive nuclear weapons program that they refuse to acknowledge, that they stole from the United States, and they're the ones screeching about genocidal regimes having secret nuclear programs.
So recently, Ian Carrol did a podcast about the truth when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons program and Israel's nuclear weapons program. And he really gets into and dives into how this is wrapped around the whole propaganda campaign used to sell this war and U.S. intervention into this war. So let's watch, let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So last Thursday, Israel launched preemptive strikes on Iran, meaning they started a war. They targeted their nuclear facilities, their military capabilities, and also every top official that was one day away from making progress in peace talks and diplomatic nuclear negotiations with the United States. Israeli and American deep state media and pundits flooded the airwaves with fear propaganda about how Iran was just months or even weeks away from having a nuclear bomb. Oh, wait, sorry. Wrong headline. That one's from 1995 when I was just 3 years old. See, here we go. Iran is 1 or 2 weeks away from producing material for a nuclear weapon. Right, but this was a year ago, and Iran is still not producing the 90% enriched uranium that Blinken was talking about.
Yeah, this has been a long-held tradition by Netanyahu, by neocon hawks to talk about the threat of supposedly Iran developing a nuclear weapon. I've seen news articles that go back to the 80s where they warned about the fact that Iran was just, months or years away from that. There's many documented examples of Netanyahu saying this going back as early as 1992. He's constantly tried to sell it over and over and over. And for some reason, no one in the corporate media, no establishment politician says, hey, wait, maybe he's lying about this. Maybe there's, duplicitous motives here, which might include regime change, which, oh yeah, by the way, he talks about and promotes openly.
But regardless, the current narrative is that after years of warnings and intelligence gathering, the Iranian regime has reached a point of no return in its quest for nuclear bombs. Now, it's important to note that this is based off of intelligence gathered by Israel, which has never led us astray before. Certainly never has misleading and outright false Israeli intelligence been used to drag the U.S. into a disastrous Middle Eastern war before.
No, certainly not Iraq or Syria or Libya or now Iran or bomb the Yemenis just a few months ago. That's never been done before whatsoever. Ian's totally right.
I mean, this is, of course, despite the fact that just this year, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence and the head of the U.S. intelligence community, clearly stated in her annual threat assessment that Iran is, quote, not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khomeini has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. But that doesn't stop Israeli conspiracy theorists from stating that the Iranian regime has been advancing a secret plan involving nuclear scientists working secretly to develop nuclear weapons.
Right, but you're the conspiracy theorist, and I'm the conspiracy theorist for pointing this out, that not even the CIA and Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's hand-picked director of national intelligence, sells the lie that they're trying to use to sell this war and sell U.S. involvement in this war. I mean, it's also worth mentioning here that Tulsi's report, which is called an annual threat assessment, also found that not only does MI6 believe the same thing, but also Mossad. And maybe there's some areas in which they basically disagree, but in most areas they agree that Iran doesn't have a nuke. They're not even within, close to being able to produce one, although they are enriching uranium. That has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. You need that for nuclear power. So yeah, glad this is being brought up.
And I mean, Israel would know. They are virtually neighbors with Iran and have one of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies operating today, closely monitoring the situation, which is why Bibi gave this address to Congress about the matter.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons.
Sorry, my bad. Wrong clip. That was Netanyahu telling us there was no question whatsoever that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons back in 2003. Obviously, that turned out to be an abject lie. I'm sure Bibi didn't know it was a lie, though. I'm sure he would never lie to get the U.S. into a Middle Eastern war to benefit Israeli interests, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he was considered a regional expert during that, pre-Iraq war propaganda campaign. And he said that immense reverberations would break out throughout the Middle East and beneficial tides would come to the Middle East as a result of displacing Saddam. Obviously, we haven't seen that. ISIS took over, and now it's being led by fundamentalists. After 20 years of occupation, of trying to export democracy, this crazy fairy tale foreign policy of the neocons.
But anyways, here he is lecturing his AIPAC purchased Congress about Iran's nuclear threat.
I'm deeply humbled by the opportunity to speak for a third time before the most important legislative body in the world, the U.S. Congress. I deeply regret that some perceive my being here as political. That was never my intention.
Never. But I'm so glad they're giving coverage to the true U.S. president here in Congress, because you don't get that much coverage of the president in Congress sometimes.
I come here today because as Prime Minister of Israel, I feel a profound obligation to speak to you about an issue that could well threaten the survival of my country and the future of my people. While the final deal has not yet been signed, certain elements of any potential deal are now a matter of public record. You can Google it. This deal has two major concessions. One, leaving Iran with a vast nuclear program. And two, lifting the restrictions on that program in about a decade. A deal that's supposed to prevent nuclear proliferation would instead spark a nuclear arms race in the most dangerous part of the planet.
You get the idea. And if you didn't know, that was actually 10 years ago, in 2015. You see, Zionist warhawks have been plotting the destruction of Iran since they published the Clean Break Report, all the way back in 1996, detailing how in order to pursue peace in the Middle East, Israel just needed to go do a little bit of war with Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Well, Iran is the last one on the list, and now, 30 years, 3 government corruption trials, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives, and tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars later, Benjamin Netanyahu is finally putting the finishing touches on the plan to secure the realm.
Yes, certainly is. And one thing that Netanyahu pointed out in that speech, it was in 2015, as Ian said, he said that Iran poses a serious threat to Israel, and he's trying to sell that it poses a serious threat to the U.S. too. He was doing it back then, he's doing it now. But that's actually not true. What poses a threat to Israel is continuing this line of foreign policy that they want to enact genocide in Gaza and this bombing campaign in Iran. And if they do that, what the true threat is if the U.S. withdrew its funding to Israel and they continued on that path. The U.S. would no longer have its back, and they wouldn't be able to get away with this. That's what truly would threaten them.
But is Iran actually as close to a nuclear weapon as Netanyahu claims? Because when you actually look behind the salacious headlines and do a little research, it's not so clear. And just to be clear, I am no expert. I've never been to Iran. I'm not paid to have an opinion by the U.S. or the Israeli government. I'm not educated in deep state think tanks and never went to the island to diddle kids.
Amen. I have the same credentials, and I love the snark. Bringing up the Douglas Murray versus Dave Smith debate, if you could call that debate, when Murray said, you've never been to the crossings. Oh, man. Good stuff, Ian. Good stuff.
So I'm really not that qualified to speak on the topic, but I figured I'd do a little reading and just see what my feeble American mind could come up with. Because Netanyahu is claiming that he had to act in order to preempt a secret Iranian program and that Tehran already had the capacity to build 9 nuclear bombs. But is it possible that he was preempting a diplomatic agreement between the U.S. and Iran? Or even just to further progress the war, to keep the spotlight off of his looming corruption trial and likely imprisonment the moment Israel is no longer at war? Because if you haven't seen the episode I did on Candace's channel about the Bibi files and his corruption trial, it's a must watch for everyone all around the world. I'll drop the link into the description below. You can check it out later. But aside from his corruption trial, the claim that Iran is about to have a nuclear weapon runs contrary to not only Tulsi Gabbard and the U.S. intel community's assessment, but also that of the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that there's no reason for concern. Iran had stepped away from the negotiation table since Trump backed out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. In recent years, more radical figures in Iran's government have been more emboldened to call for a nuclear-armed Iran. The International Atomic Energy Agency released a report this week that said Iran has recently been failing to cooperate with complete inspections of its civilian nuclear program. It did not say that Iran was on the verge of a nuclear weapon. In fact, it concluded that it had, quote, no credible indications of an ongoing undeclared structured nuclear program. The statistic that has many the most concerned is Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. This is essentially a deterrent strategy on Iran's behalf.
Yes, exactly.
Obviously, it didn't turn out so well, but you get the point. To simplify it, is that for civilian nuclear energy, you only need about 3% enriched uranium. Very little. To build a nuclear bomb, however, you need about 90% enriched uranium, super pure. And so 90% enriched uranium is highly regulated and monitored. It's an extremely expensive and laborious process to create it. And so Iran has been stockpiling 60% enriched uranium for quite some time as a sort of threat that they could build a bomb if they feel threatened or have reason to.
And it's not even a threat, it's a defensive measure after the JCPOA got torn up by Trump. I don't know what I would do. I think I do know actually what I would do, and I would do the same thing Iran's doing, is enriching higher percentage uranium because, you know, these regimes have been threatening to overturn me and topple me for as long as I've lived. You know, with Israel and the United States at its throats, the U.S. funded a proxy war against Iran in the 80s. They overthrew the government in 1953. That didn't pay off too well, right? Because the Ayatollahs took over in 79. And the U.S. shot down a commercial airliner, an Iranian commercial airliner, I believe in 89. If you Google Iran Flight 655, you can find that out. So the U.S. has been adversarial toward Iran forever. There's been talk about regime change. He talked about the clean break memo. And Netanyahu has been calling for the Libyan model to apply there. That's a regime change. So this is a strategy to put them at the verge of thresholds in which they wouldn't be under compliance, such that if they were attacked, they could build a nuke. And that's what I would do too. Look at North Korea. They have a nuke, and it's taken regime change off the table. Gaddafi gave his nuclear weapons program up in the mid-2000s, and he got toppled. So that's why, and it makes total sense.
At least that's the idea. What Israel is claiming is that they have some secret program where they are finishing the enrichment and building a bomb. What the IAEA report says is that they see no evidence of that happening. And if Iran were to develop a nuclear weapon, that would be shitty. Iran is certainly not the kind of kid on the playground that you want walking around with the big red button. But it's important to put this in context. The playground that Iran is on is the Middle East. They pose absolutely zero threat to America. A nuclear bomb requires a delivery method. You have to get it to your target before you can blow it up, obviously. With a nuke, that's usually a ballistic missile fired from the ground or a plane or a submarine. Iran's current range is limited to its neighborhood. China, Russia, Egypt, or India all might have some concern about Iranian nuclear capability. But beyond that, there is virtually no threat, at least not to America. One could argue that they would try to smuggle a suitcase nuke into the United States, but I would argue that I'm more concerned about another Middle Eastern country doing that. So, anyways, this map is critical to understanding calls for the U.S. to go to war in Iran and all the fear-mongering about Iranian nuclear weapons right now. All the first Tel Aviv and then New York. Oh no! It's propaganda.
It is. The mushroom cloud over New York has no basis in reality, and we've seen this same kind of fervor and same kind of propaganda campaign as we did in 2003 with Iraq. Obviously, they're repeating the same playbook. Some people are buying into it, and it's really tragic that they are, because this stuff just doesn't bear fruit anymore. You know, thankfully, we're in an age of independent media and such, where it's not just corporate media drilling the CIA's talking points into our head, and there's people like Ian talking about this, but he's right.
Iran not only poses no threat to the United States, but it is also highly incentivized not to poke the United States and induce us into entering this war. If there's a terrorist attack on American soil that gets used to justify war in Iran, you can bet the farm that it's not Iran behind it. Iran wants to fight Israel on its own. They aren't dumb. Israel is the country that wants America to enter the war that they started. So, it's a good thing that Israel has never taken part in any false flag attacks on American soil before. Otherwise, I would be a little worried that they might do that again. Because you see, Iran did go through a phase where it seemed to be working directly towards nuclear weapons, starting back in 1997. But by late 2003, after seeing what we had just done to Saddam for not even having nukes, they decided that they probably didn't want to get caught on the other end of that if they actually did have nukes. So they shut the program down, deactivated the facilities, and shipped all the material to storage. Israel was, of course, sure to warn us that Iran was just 5 years away from a bomb at the time, a bomb which now, 30 years later, has yet to materialize.
And probably a bad strategy on Iran's part. Like I said before, look at the North Korean model. The North Koreans sought and acquired nuclear weapons, and it's essentially taken regime change off the table. Now, you'll hear some of the worst imaginable blood-soaked war hawks talk about potential North Korean regime change, but you don't hear about it as much as you did in the past. George W. Bush rattled that cage. He said they were one of 3 countries in the axis of evil. But compared to Gaddafi, look at what happened. Gaddafi gave up his nukes. He got toppled. North Korea has them. They can't really get toppled, or they can only get toppled at considerable risk, which almost no one is willing to accept. So Ian's right. Under this twisted incentive structure, Israel wants the U.S. in this war. So it actually would rather have U.S. soldiers die such that it guarantees full-bore U.S. entry, whereas Iran has no incentive to strike the U.S. because that assures their destruction. It assures that the U.S. is going to get involved in the war, topple the regime. It's not going to be pretty. The occupation process is probably going to be horrific, as it always is in all these catastrophes like Afghanistan and Iran and Syria. The U.S. is still occupying part of Syria in the northeast. Iraq, there's still 1,000 soldiers there, and that's a mess. All these things are just nonsense, and it bears repeating how much they've failed in the past.
Lately, this image documenting all of Netanyahu's alleged claims about Iran's imminent nuclear bomb has been floating around Twitter. It's nothing new. And, as you should, you may be wondering, how can we just trust some random Twitter graphic with wild claims like this? You're correct. You should not trust random Twitter graphics. You should do your own research and verify. So, I'll get you started with the first one. In 1992, Benjamin Netanyahu published a column in Israeli newspaper Yedioth Aharonoth, which, also, side note, just so happens to be the same newspaper that he stands accused of trading political favors with in exchange for positive media coverage, an offense that could and should land him in prison when he's convicted. But anyways, the headline in Ynet News is a bit confusing because Netanyahu published this column in 1992 and then went on to repeat his claims in 1993 that Iran would have the bomb by 1999, which is now 26 years ago. He's repeated that claim again and again ever since, whenever it's convenient. Iran is an extremist genocidal regime that must not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons at any cost. And
they say this while they're cleansing Gaza. The warpath of destruction there, whether you want to call it a genocide or not, I do. But the more important thing is that the U.S. shouldn't be involved in aiding that nonsense. And it is to a historical level. Our criminal government sent $200 billion to Israel last year. And I think it's on pace for that this year. Before that, Israel got about $4 billion a year. It's the largest foreign recipient of U.S. aid money in general, and it doesn't bear any success for the U.S. It doesn't lend itself to our national security. Quite to the contrary, it makes us inherit all the enemies of Israel, which is essentially the rest of the Middle East for the most part.
Yeah, sure. But the absolute ass-backwards tragic irony of this whole situation is that Israel, currently run by Jewish supremacists and terrorists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the nation that is conducting a literal genocide right now on live TV and did this to civilians trapped in Gaza, they are the ones that have a secret stolen nuclear arsenal. Israel has an extensive nuclear weapons program that they refuse to acknowledge, that they stole from the United States, and they're the ones screeching about genocidal regimes having secret nuclear programs. So here's a clip making the rounds right now to help give you a sense for the Israeli position on the matter.
How many nuclear weapons does Iran have as of today?
Right now, I hope none.
Okay, how many does Israel have?
No idea.
No idea. You were in the government. They don't tell you that stuff.
No idea.
Who do they tell?
No idea.
Do you recognize the hypocrisy of Israel
No.
having a secret illicit nuclear weapons program that it won't open up its doors to and won't talk about, and then lecturing everyone else in the region about nuclear
Absolutely
weapons?
not. You know why?
You talked about hypocrisy. If an Iranian guest came on my show and I asked him about Iran's nuclear program, he said, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about it. Would you be okay with that? You'd be outraged.
Of course
And
I
yet
would
you
be.
sit here as a former
Of course I
minister of
would
the
be,
Israeli
because-
government saying, oh, I don't know, never talked about nukes with anyone.
Because there was like 16 United Nations Security Council resolutions against Iran.
And there is
Iran was
against
a
Israel.
signatory
And there is
like
against Israel as
none
well.
About
Your nuclear
issues?
program?
No.
Yes, there is. UN
So-
Resolution 487. Let me read it to you. The UN Security Council in 1981 says, calls upon Israel urgently to place its nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA. Why haven't you done that?
Because
That smile really says it all. As you can see, Israeli spokesmen don't really like to talk about it because there's just no way to defend it, even if they wanted to. But they're not allowed to because Israel's nuclear program officially doesn't exist. So here's an even more awkward clip to help fill out the point.
Why should the world tolerate you having nuclear weapons and not, say, Iran?
First, again, we never admitted to have such a weapons, but the very comparison is, I must say, it's very insulting, and I tell you why. We suffered one Holocaust. We listened to our neighbors.
Is it because of the Holocaust
Right
that
to
you
the
should be
Holocaust.
allowed to have nuclear weapons?
You know what? This interview was finished now.
This is so absurd. They essentially assert that to get you to answer whether you have a nuclear weapons program, it's comparable to the Holocaust, and it'd be suffering a proverbial second Holocaust he's implying. This is absolutely crazy, and there's been other funny moments like this. I hate to even laugh about it. It's just so absurd. Like, there's a Piers Morgan clip where Dave Smith was there with a lawyer that represents the Israeli government, and Dave said, Piers, ask her if Israel has nuclear weapons. And Piers is like, yeah, good point, Dave. Do they have nuclear weapons? And they have the same response. They have to become like a Marlon Brando-like actor at that point to try to shield the fact that they have nuclear weapons. They obviously have nuclear weapons. They just don't want to be subject to any of the regulations that bind IAEA countries, including Iran, by the way, who is bound to that, and Israel, who is not. So you ironically have this entity launching a war that has a secret nuclear weapons program against a country that they say, well, they have a secret nuclear weapons program. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. The irony is inescapable.
Your
Shut it
attitude is so
down.
hostile.
Wait,
And your
hey,
questions
just
are-
shut it down. Shut it down. Just shut it right down. That was so disrespectful for him to even make the compare, to even ask the question. He like blood libeled him right there on the spot. Yeah, you heard that correctly. You are apparently a blood libeling anti-Semite if you want to talk about Israel's nuclear program, which the whole world knows about. But Israel, like a literal 5-year-old, just says, no, I don't have any nukes in there. Like, okay, then let's open it up and see, just to make sure. But no, that's totally not cool with them. That's actually super offensive to even suggest.
Amazing video. This is the most ultimate irony of the situation we're dealing with right now, and gotta love Ian. This video was fantastically put together, well researched, but he's catching fire of something that's not being talked about too much, at least in the corporate media and in the mainstream. Certainly not in the political establishment that's still beating the war drums over this thing to support our greatest ally in the Middle East that only wants the best for us, despite the fact that they would do anything to pull the US into this war. And I think the reason for that is because I don't believe that even if you think that this war is about curtailing the nuclear weapons program, which it's not, it's about regime change, but even if you did think that, I don't think Israel has the resources to do that on their own, especially because the US provides the weaponry, the intelligence, and the funding to even make what they're doing right now happen. So take that away, and I don't think they'd be able to do it. So they desperately are incentivized to draw the U.S. into the war. So far, I think Netanyahu's been successful in that. I hate to say that. Trump seems to be complicit with tanking the negotiations at one point, switching to a strategy of asking for no nuclear weapons program to, oh wait, now you can't enrich uranium at all. And that's a non-starter that no one would accept because they have an extensive nuclear power program. The citizens need that. Their economy needs that. It'd be helpful if that's expanded in the U.S. I think the U.S. has only built 1 or 2 nuclear power plants in like the last 3 or 4 decades. But anyways, Ian's on the right track here. This is the ultimate irony that we face. It doesn't bode well for the U.S. to get involved. And the way they're selling this is the most hypocritical of any war I think they've ever sold. Any war that the regime has sold, the Israeli lobby, the Zionists, whatever you want to say, the military-industrial complex, the war machine, this is the most dishonest and hypocritical way to sell the war. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Is this the biggest irony in this situation? Should the U.S. be involved at all? What's a reasonable solution that's not as utopian to get out of this thing than cut all aid to Israel, even though we know that's the solution that needs to happen? Let me know in the comments below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and consider supporting me as a YouTube member or as a Patreon patron. I would really appreciate that support. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.